She grew up quietly, away from the spotlight, choosing purpose over pageantry. Never demanding a title, never seeking attention, she lived her life on her own terms. And now, Britain cannot stop talking about her. Lady Louise Windsor, the young royal whose quiet strength always hinted at something extraordinary, has finally done the unthinkable, leaving the world stunned. There is a photograph, not widely circulated, not staged for the press, that captures something essential about Lady Louise Windsor. She is standing beside a carriage at Windsor Great Park, reins loose in her hands, her expression caught somewhere between concentration and quiet joy. The horses shift beside her, steam rising gently in the morning air, and she looks for all the world like someone who has found exactly where she belongs. No cameras were invited, no announcements were made, she was simply there, doing what she loves. Carrying the legacy of a grandfather she adored into a future that belongs entirely to her. It is that image, more than any palace balcony appearance, more than any red carpet moment, that tells you who Lady Louise Windsor really is. And it is that same quiet, unhurried sense of self that makes the news now sweeping through Britain all the more extraordinary. Because Lady Louise, the young woman who has spent her entire life deliberately stepping away from the glare, has just stepped into it. Not by accident, not under pressure, but on her own terms, in her own time, with the kind of grace that seems to come to her as naturally as breathing. The announcement, when it came, landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved outward fast, touching every corner of the royal conversation, catching commentators mid-sentence and sending journalists scrambling for context. Britain, it turns out, had been watching Lady Louise for years without quite realizing how closely. And now, with the news of her engagement confirmed, the country finds itself doing something it rarely does when it comes to the younger royals. It finds itself genuinely moved. To understand why this moment carries such weight, you have to go back to the beginning, not to a grand state occasion or a public christening, but to a cold November morning in 2003 at Frimley Park Hospital in Surrey. Louise Alice Elizabeth Mary Mountbatten Windsor arrived 6 weeks early, and the circumstances of her birth were, by any measure, frightening. She was delivered by emergency cesarean section after her mother, Sophie, the Countess of Wessex, suffered a major hemorrhage. For a few terrible hours, the outcome for both mother and child was uncertain. Doctors worked through the night, the family waited, and then, quietly, miraculously, both Sophie and her daughter turned a corner. It was not the birth of a princess, at least not in the official sense. Her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, had already made a choice that would define how their daughter moved through the world. Unlike other children born into the direct royal line, Louise would not carry the title of princess. She would be Lady Louise, a decision that reflected something her parents believed deeply about the kind of life they wanted for their children. A life with room in it. Room for education, for privacy, for mistakes, for growth, for the ordinary accumulating texture of a real human childhood. She grew up at Bagshot Park in Surrey, a house that sits within the royal estate, but carries none of the museum-like formality of the palaces. It is a home with horses and dogs and the smell of countryside mornings, a place where her parents worked hard to create something that felt, in spite of everything, normal. Louise attended St. George's School in Windsor, the same school attended by the children of castle staff and local families. Not an elite boarding institution designed to separate children from the world, but a place where she learned alongside peers whose surnames carried no particular weight. Those who knew her during those early years describe a child who was watchful before she was expressive, who listened more than she spoke, who seemed to be quietly taking the measure of everything around her. She was curious without being showy, determined without being obvious about it. Her teachers noticed that she had an unusual ability to concentrate, to sit with something difficult until she understood it fully, rather than moving on at the pace set by others. It was a quality that would serve her well. Her relationship with her grandfather, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, is one of the great defining threads of her story. Philip was, by the time Louise came into his life, an old man by conventional measure, but there was nothing diminished about his presence or his passions. He had spent decades driving carriages competitively, a sport that demands extraordinary physical coordination, mental precision, and an almost telepathic relationship between driver and horse. He was one of the finest carriage drivers Britain had ever produced, and when young Louise showed an interest in the sport, something lit up between them. She was still a small girl when Philip first put the reins into her hands. Those who witnessed those early lessons say she took to it with an immediacy that surprised even her grandfather. She was not afraid of the horses, not intimidated by the weight and motion of the carriage, not overwhelmed by the instructions. She absorbed them. She practiced. She returned the next day and the day after that. Philip, a man not given to easy praise, is said to have told family members that Louise had a genuine gift. Coming from him, those words meant everything. The carriage driving became more than a pastime. It became a language between grandfather and granddaughter, a way of communicating something that did not require words. When Philip passed away in April 2021, Louise was 17 years old. The loss hit her with a force that those close to her say she carried quietly, without display, in the way she had been raised to carry difficult things. But she continued driving. She competed at the Royal Windsor Horse Show the following year, stepping into the arena her grandfather had loved, handling the very horses he had driven, doing so not as a tribute performance, but as a continuation, a statement that his legacy lived in her hands. The world noticed, not loudly at first, but steadily. There was something about seeing this young woman in that arena, conducting herself with such composure and skill that shifted the public's perception of her. She was no longer simply a name on a royal family tree. She was someone with a history, a talent, a story worth following. By the time she enrolled at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland in 2022, Lady Louise Windsor had become one of the more quietly compelling figures in the British royal landscape. St. Andrews, of course, carries its own royal residences. It is where King Charles, then Prince William, met Catherine Middleton, where a love story that would reshape the monarchy began over shared lectures in university halls. Louise arrived at the same institution carrying none of that weight, or at least choosing not to carry it. She was there to study English literature, drawn to the discipline with the same focused curiosity that had defined her approach to everything. University life suited her. Friends describe her as someone who integrates easily without losing herself, who can be entirely present in a conversation without performing for it, who brings a quality of attention to the people around her that makes them feel genuinely seen. She found a community there, a circle of friends who had chosen her for herself rather than for her surname, and in that community she began to breathe in a way that royal life, for all its gifts, sometimes makes difficult. It was within this circle that Felix first appeared. Felix, whose full name those close to the situation speak with a careful kind of warmth, came into Louise's life the way the most significant people often do. Not with fanfare, not with drama, but gradually, incrementally, through the accumulation of shared time and honest conversation. He is, by all accounts, someone who understands what it means to stand beside a person of public significance without being consumed by that significance. He has been described by those who know him as grounded, thoughtful, and possessed of a particular quality of steadiness that does not waver under pressure. Their early friendship was not immediately visible to the outside world. They moved through the same social landscape with the kind of easy familiarity that suggests comfort rather than calculation. He appeared at events not as a presence demanding attention, but as someone comfortable enough in his own skin to be entirely focused on her. He's watched her compete at carriage-driving events from the stands, not with the studied casualness of someone performing indifference, but with the open, unconcealed admiration of a person who has found something genuinely worth watching. Those who observed them together in these early months noted the way the dynamic between them seemed to operate on a frequency slightly removed from the social noise around them. They talked, really talked, in the middle of gatherings that could easily have become performance. They left events together at unhurried paces. They were spotted on walks through the St. Andrews coastline, on quiet evenings in the town, in the kind of ordinary settings that speak louder than any public appearance about the texture of a relationship. As the months passed and the friendship deepened into something unmistakably more, Louise and Felix developed an approach to their relationship that mirrored the values she had been raised to hold. Privacy was not a defense mechanism. It was an expression of respect for each other, for the relationship itself, for the people around them who might otherwise be drawn into a story before it was ready to be told. They were not hiding. They were simply choosing the pace at which things moved, and that pace was entirely their own. Her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, watched this development with the quiet attention of people who have always understood that their daughter's heart was her own to give. Edward and Sophie have built their public life on a foundation of genuine partnership, one of the most quietly admired marriages in the modern royal family, and their influence on Louise is visible in everything she does. They have never pushed her toward the spotlight. They have never framed her life as a performance for public consumption. And in her relationship with Felix, Louise seems to be living out the lesson they have taught most consistently, that love, real love, is something you protect before you share it. The engagement itself, when it became known, arrived in a way entirely consistent with who Louise is. There was no carefully orchestrated leak to a sympathetic tabloid. There was no strategic photo call on the steps of a landmark building. There was instead the kind of quiet confirmation that speaks of a couple who had already lived fully inside this decision before they shared it with anyone else. The ring, described by those who have seen it as beautiful and personal without being ostentatious, reflects the same sensibility. It is not a statement piece. It is a promise piece. The reaction across Britain moved through several registers in quick succession. First, surprise, because in spite of the whispers that had circulated in recent months, many had assumed the engagement was still some time away. Then delight, the particular kind of delight the British public reserves for royal stories that feel genuinely romantic, rather than institutionally managed. And then, underneath, both of those, something more reflective. A recognition that Lady Louise Windsor represents something the monarchy has perhaps needed for some time. A member of the family who carries the lineage without being defined by it, who can speak to a younger generation without condescension, who has earned her public presence through character rather than circumstance. The comparison to other royal love stories is inevitable, and yet it is the differences that are most instructive. Catherine Middleton, now Princess of Wales, navigated years of public scrutiny before her engagement, enduring a level of media attention that was by any measure relentless. Meghan Markle arrived in the royal family already a public figure, with all the complications that entailed. Louise's path has been quieter, more interior, more deliberately shielded from the mechanisms of public narrative. And Felix, unlike those who came before him into similar situations, has had the advantage of being relatively unknown to the press, which has allowed their relationship to develop in something closer to real time rather than in the distorted acceleration of tabloid coverage. There is a generation of young British people watching Lady Louise's story unfold with a particular kind of investment. She is of their age, educated at a university they might attend, interested in the things they find interesting, navigating a world that places enormous pressure on young women to perform, to present, to be consistently legible and appealing to an audience that never fully switches off. Louise's response to that pressure has been consistent and quietly radical. She has simply declined to perform. She has lived her life, chosen her passions, loved the people she loves, and let the audience catch up in its own time. Her carriage driving continues to sit at the center of who she is, and this matters more than it might initially appear. In a royal family navigating enormous upheaval, in an institution under consistent scrutiny about its relevance and its future, there is something profoundly stabilizing about a young woman who takes up a thread from her grandfather's life and carries it forward. Philip gave her the reins in both the literal and figurative sense, and she has never let them go. Felix, it should be noted, has been present for some of her most significant competitive moments. He understands what carriage driving means to her, which means he understands something essential about who she is and where she comes from. A partner who can hold the weight of another person's inheritance, who can stand at the edge of an arena where history is being quietly honored and find it moving rather than bewildering, is no ordinary partner. Those who have observed him at these events describe someone who is fully present in them, not enduring a royal obligation but genuinely engaged, genuinely admiring. The timing of the engagement, coming in the months following her graduation, carries its own significance. Louise has been deliberate about the sequencing of her life in a way that speaks of someone who thinks carefully about what she builds and when. She completed her education first. She established herself as a person before she stepped into this next chapter. That kind of intentionality is, in the context of royal engagements, relatively rare, and it says something important about the marriage she is entering and the partnership she is building. There are questions, of course, about what her public role will look like going forward, whether she will take on royal duties more formally, whether the engagement will shift the careful balance of privacy and visibility she has maintained, whether the pressures that come with this kind of announcement will change the quality of the life she has built. Those close to her suggest that she and her family have thought through these questions carefully, and that the answers will emerge gradually, in the same unhurried way everything about Louise tends to emerge. What seems certain is that she will not become someone she is not. The choice to remain Lady Louise, to forego the princess title she could have claimed, was never simply about practicality. It was a statement of identity, a declaration that she understood the difference between what she was born into and who she intended to become. She has spent 20 years becoming someone, and now, in this moment of public attention and private joy, she is entirely herself. That is the thing about Lady Louise Windsor that keeps drawing people back to her story. As the news settles across Britain and the first photographs begin to circulate, as the commentators parse the significance, and the well-wishers flood the digital spaces where royal news now lives, there is a moment worth pausing in. Somewhere, perhaps at Windsor Great Park, perhaps on a quiet street in Fife, Lady Louise Windsor is moving through her day with the same calm, focused energy she has always carried. There are reigns to hold, conversations to have, a life to live. The announcement has been made, the world has responded, and she has noted both with the measured attention of someone who has always understood that the world's reaction to your story and the story itself are two very different things. She surprised Britain once, on the morning she arrived early and uncertain into a world that was not quite ready for her. She has surprised Britain again now, with the quiet announcement of a love that was built in the spaces where cameras do not reach. And if Lady Louise Windsor has taught us anything at all, it is that the next surprise is already in motion, unhurried, unannounced, and entirely on her own terms.